Before we begin this story, take a second and look around wherever you are watching this video right now. Maybe you're at home, maybe on your phone during a break, maybe halfway across the world from the Philippines. Drop your city or country in the comments below so we can see just how far these incredible stories travel. Because tonight's story isn't just another war tale. It's about patience, courage, and one of the most ingenious sabotage operations ever carried out along a hostile coastline. Imagine an enemy base so heavily defended that even seasoned military planners called it impossible to attack. Thick concrete bunkers, machine gun nests facing the sea, patrol boats circling the waters, and mines hidden beneath the wave. Any direct assault would have been suicide. Yet one night, without artillery, without airstrikes, and without a large army, a small group of Filipino saboteurs prepared to strike. Moving silently through darkness, they began their infiltration toward the heavily guarded coastline. What they discovered was not a weakness in the walls or the guns, but in the rhythm of the ocean itself. Under the cover of darkness, the saboteurs carried out their dangerous underwater operation. As the tide began to rise, the sea itself started turning against the base that believed it was protected. Suddenly the night erupted as explosions tore through the coastal defenses. Flames spread across the base while water surged through shattered fortifications. By sunrise, the supposedly impenetrable coastal fortress was burning, flooded, and abandoned. The story begins during the brutal years of World War II, when the Philippines became one of the fiercest battlegrounds in the Pacific. Coastal bases were critical for controlling supply routes, troop movements, and naval patrols. One particular enemy stronghold sat along a narrow stretch of coastline surrounded by cliffs and shallow reef. From the air, the base looked like a fortress carved directly into the rock. Heavy cannons pointed toward the open sea, radar towers watched the horizon, and layers of barbed wire protected the landward side. Any soldier approaching from land would have to cross exposed terrain under machine gun fire. Approaching from the water was even worse. The shallows were filled with underwater obstacles designed to rip open boats before they could reach the shore. For months, Allied reconnaissance studied the base, searching desperately for a weakness. None appeared. Even veteran officers eventually concluded that the base would have to remain untouched until a much larger invasion force could arrive, but unknown to them, Filipino resistance fighters nearby had already begun to notice something outsiders had completely overlooked. These men were fishermen, boat builders, and coastal villagers who had spent their entire lives studying the rhythm of the sea. Long before the war arrived, they navigated those waters in wooden outriggers, reading the currents and tides the way others read road signs. When enemy forces built their fortress along that coastline, they believed the ocean would act as a natural shield. But the locals knew the sea behaved differently at certain hours. Twice each day, the tide surged inward with tremendous force, pushing water far beyond the normal shoreline. Hidden channels between the reefs suddenly became deep enough for small boats to slip through. Narrow gaps that seemed impossible to navigate during low tide briefly transformed into silent pathways. At first, these fishermen simply observed the changes quietly, unsure whether the information mattered. But as the months passed and resistance networks grew stronger, someone realized the potential. If the sea could temporarily open a path through the reef, perhaps a small sabotage team could reach the base unnoticed, not by charging in like soldiers but by letting the tide carry them in like shadows drifting with the water. The resistance fighters began carefully studying the enemy's routine. Patrol boats circled the area during daylight and early evening, but after midnight the waters often grew quiet. Guards assumed that the jagged reefs made night approaches impossible anyway. But the fishermen knew something different happened around 2 hours before the highest tide. Powerful currents flowed through hidden channels that only locals understood. If someone entered those currents at the right moment, the sea itself would carry them silently toward the base. That discovery changed everything, revealing that the fortress had a brief window of vulnerability each night. The resistance leaders decided that if they could sneak a sabotage team inside the harbor during the tidal surge, they could destroy key targets. But the plan required incredible precision, because arriving too early would mean the reefs tearing the boats apart. Arrive too late and the tide would trap them inside enemy territory by morning, making the entire mission depend not on clocks but on the rising and falling breath of the ocean. Preparing the mission took weeks as the saboteurs trained and planned along the quiet coastline. The saboteurs could not risk using large boats that would attract attention. Instead, they modified traditional fishing outriggers to carry small explosive charges hidden inside baskets that normally held net. From a distance, they looked exactly like ordinary fishermen returning from a night at sea. But every man involved knew the truth. Once they crossed the reef during high tide, there would be no easy escape. The enemy base had searchlights, watchtowers, and armed guards who would not hesitate to shoot intruders. The saboteurs practiced moving silently, rowing without splashing, and coordinating every movement with precision. They trained to navigate narrow reef passages even in darkness where a single mistake could be fatal. They also carried crude but effective explosives designed to destroy fuel tanks and wooden docks. The goal wasn't simply to damage the base, but to unleash chaos. Fires spreading through fuel stores, explosions destroying patrol boats, and confusion so overwhelming that the entire fortress would become unusable overnight. Finally the night arrived, with thick clouds covering the sky and hiding the moon in near-total darkness. For the saboteurs, that deep darkness was perfect for what they were about to do. They launched their small outriggers from a quiet fishing village several kilometers away. Slowly, they began rowing across calm waters toward the distant reef line. At first the water was shallow and still, with jagged coral formations lurking just beneath the surface like deadly teeth. Anyone unfamiliar with the area would have turned back immediately, but the fishermen guiding the mission knew exactly where to go. They waited patiently as the first powerful surge of the rising tide began pushing inland. Then, one by one, the boats slipped into the narrow channels between the reef. The current grabbed them instantly, pulling them forward faster than any paddle could, while silence filled the night. With only the creaking of wood and distant crashing waves, the sea itself carried them straight toward the enemy fortress. As they drifted closer, the outline of the base slowly appeared against the darkness. Searchlights occasionally swept across the water, scanning for any sign of movement. The saboteurs hugged the shadows near the cliffs, staying hidden from view. The tide had risen higher now, flooding parts of the rocky shoreline that were normally dry. That unexpected depth allowed the boats to slip into areas that enemy planners believed were impassable. As they approached the harbor structures, the saboteurs split into small teams. One group moved toward the fuel storage tanks to begin planting charges. Another team quietly approached the wooden docks where patrol boats were tied up. A third group targeted communication lines and generator sheds, placing explosives with precision. Within minutes, they were moving silently along the base, planting explosives while guards above remained completely unaware that enemy fighters had already slipped inside their supposedly impenetrable perimeter. One saboteur carefully attached charges beneath the fuel storage valve. Another crawled beneath a dock and secured explosives to the wooden support beams. The entire plan relied on a carefully timed chain reaction. When the first blast ignited the fuel tanks, flames would spread rapidly through nearby structures. The fire would then reach the docks, destroying patrol boats before crews could react. Meanwhile, the communications sabotage team cut cables and damaged generators to delay any alarm. The rising tide continued creeping higher along the shoreline, covering the footprints and movements of the infiltrators. Ironically, the same ocean that protected the base during low tide was now helping to hide the attackers. The saboteurs worked quickly but calmly, knowing every minute mattered. Soon the tide would begin slowing at its peak, and once it turned, the narrow escape channels through the reef would start closing again. The first explosion shattered the silence just after midnight. A towering fireball erupted from the fuel depot, lighting the sky in blinding orange. For a split second, guards stood frozen, staring in disbelief at the sudden blast. Then the second explosion ripped through the wooden docks, sending burning debris crashing into the water. Patrol boats burst into flames as fuel spilled across the harbor surface. Fire spread rapidly across the water, turning the harbor into a blazing inferno. Chaos spread instantly through the base as soldiers ran toward the explosions, shouting orders. Others tried desperately to activate communication equipment that had already been sabotaged. Meanwhile, the saboteurs were already slipping back through the shadows toward their boat. Their mission was not to fight, but to disappear into the darkness before anyone understood what had happened. As the base erupted behind them, the saboteurs pushed their boats back into the rising water along the cliff. The tide had reached its peak now, flooding the narrow reef channels just enough for escape. Searchlights began sweeping wildly across the harbor as alarms finally sounded. But the saboteurs were already moving silently through the same hidden passages that had carried them in. The current now flowed outward, pulling their boats back toward the open sea. Behind them, secondary explosions continued erupting as fuel stores ignited one after another, sending thick smoke rising into the sky visible for miles along the coastline. By the time enemy commanders realized what had happened, the saboteurs were already far beyond the reef line. Patrol boats that might have chased them were either destroyed or trapped inside burning dock. Communication systems were crippled, delaying reinforcements from nearby bases. From the distance, the resistance fighters watched the flames engulf the once feared fortress. The supposedly impenetrable base had been crippled not by a massive assault, but by a handful of men who understood the ocean better than the enemy ever could. At dawn, reconnaissance aircraft flying over the coastline reported massive damage to the facility. Fuel reserves were gone, patrol vessels destroyed, and key infrastructure reduced to charred wreckage. Military analysts studying the destruction initially assumed the attack must have involved aircraft or naval bombardment. The idea that a small sabotage team had slipped through the reefs seemed almost impossible. Yet along the nearby villages, whispers spread quietly among the locals, because they knew the truth. The sea itself had carried the saboteurs in and carried them safely out again. The destruction of that coastal base had major consequences, leaving the once defended shoreline exposed and vulnerable. Without its fuel and patrol boats, enemy forces could no longer control that stretch of coastline. Supply routes that once seemed dangerous suddenly became accessible to Allied operations. Resistance groups gained confidence, proving that even the strongest fortifications could fall with the right knowledge. The operation became one of the most daring examples of how local understanding of the environment could overcome superior military power. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is how simple the strategy was. There were no massive fleets, no advanced technology, and no overwhelming firepower. Just fishermen who had spent their lives reading the tide charts of nature itself. In war, sometimes the greatest weapon isn't strength, it's understanding. And that brings us to the end of this incredible story of how Filipino saboteurs turned the ocean into their secret ally to destroy a supposedly impenetrable coastal base. Stories like this remind us that history is filled with hidden acts of bravery that rarely appear in textbooks. Before you go, tell us where you're watching from right now. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far these stories travel around the world. And what do you think about this daring operation? Could such a plan work in modern warfare today? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible untold moments from Philippine history, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who loves powerful historical stories.